and welcome to our webinar with Debra Band on the book on the text of Hannah, which is a haftarah that we read during the high holidays. This is one in a long series of webinars we're doing for the upcoming holiday season on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and everything that falls in between. Just a little bit about JOFA. We are the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. We're a nonprofit resource for Orthodox women, and we are here to expand spiritual, ritual, political, familial opportunities for women in the Orthodox community. We do these webinars pretty regularly. It's an amazing platform that we have and a way for us to connect with you from the comfort of your own home and to connect with people across the world, in the United States, in Israel, the UK, Australia. It's really an amazing opportunity that we have to be able to connect with you wherever you are. Our webinars address a whole range of issues. This past summer, we did a series on birth control and what that means, and both the halachic and medical parameters of birth control. As I mentioned, in the upcoming weeks, we're going to be doing many, many webinars on the high holidays. And you can check out our website or our YouTube channel to see past webinars that we've done. Tonight, we will be doing a webinar with Debra Band on one of her illuminated texts, this one in honor of the holiday season on Hannah. And I'm going to turn it over to Deborah shortly so that she can share her talk with us and share her beautiful artwork as well. But I'd first like to introduce Debra Band. Debra Band's work in Hebrew illuminated manuscripts draws upon her love of both the manuscript, art, and biblical studies. She holds a BA Honors in History from Concordia University in Montreal and an MS in Political Science from MIT, and turned full attention to Hebrew manuscript arts in 1987. Descended from an eminent rabbinic family, her extensive studies of Jewish texts and research into medieval European and Middle Eastern painting and manuscripts inform her work. Her work, celebrated for its intellectual and spiritual depth as well as its visual beauty, includes illuminated and paper-cut books and ketubot, other manuscript pieces and paper cuts, and exhibits, private collections, community institutions, and galleries across the United States, Canada, England, and South Africa. Deborah is the artist and author of The Song of Songs, The Honey Bee in the Garden, I Will Wake the Dawn, Illuminated Psalms, Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth and Hannah, Kabbalat Shabbat, The Grand Unification, with new poetry translations and literary commentaries by Raymond P. Scheinlin, a forward and prose translations by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, and preface by Arthur Green, which appeared in early September 2016. She works extensively with Women's League for Conservative Judaism and the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. Her work tours museums and galleries across the United States. Deborah lectures frequently on her work across the United States in Jewish and Christian venues. In addition to her artwork, Deborah participates in medical ethics reviews activities at the National Institutes of Health in Maryland. Deborah has lived throughout the United States and Canada and presently resides in the Washington, D.C. area. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Deborah.
Thank you. Lovely. It's wonderful to be with everyone tonight. Sure, could you put up the first slide, please?
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
Just a moment.
Okay. Aha. Okay, lovely. Does everyone see that? Great. Okay. So in a couple of weeks, we'll all read the story of Hannah, the haftarah matched with the Rosh Hashanah Torah reading about Sarah's conception of Isaac. So tonight, let's explore together what makes this human story not only so very moving, but also so very important in our spiritual life as women and as Jews, and also what makes it so fundamental a moment in the birth of Am Yisrael. So we're going to explore these ideas through the visual midrash embodied in the illuminated paintings in my book, Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth and Hannah. Now, one of the key issues in this tale is the question of a family dealing with infertility. And so I've invited an old friend of mine, Ingrid Cohn-Paymar, more importantly, an accomplished therapist in this area, to discuss and take questions on this sensitive matter after my own presentation. I'll introduce Ingrid properly a little bit later. Please do ask questions throughout. You will see, whether relating to the story, the paintings, or the infertility issue. You'll see a chat box at the side of your screen, so please don't be shy about submitting questions that way. Shira will pass the questions on to Ingrid and me after our talks. Before I get started, though, I need to thank the JOFA staff, Sharon Weiss-Greenberg, Shira, and in particular, Sharon and Steve Lieberman for their support of this project altogether. Next slide, please. Great. So one of the reasons this story is so fascinating is that, like the other two coherent women's tales of early Israel, that of Deborah in Judges and Megillat Ruth, we have here one of the formative stories of Am Yisrael. This time a sliver view of one woman's life, of family life in the earliest generations of our settlement of the land after returning from Egypt. Now, Hannah's story is also the story of the birth of the prophet Samuel, who would invent the Israelite monarchy. Now, whereas much of the lasting impact of Deborah and Ruth was political in nature, Hannah's legacy is directly spiritual, and we'll see how soon. Next slide, please. Great, okay. Before I go any further, let me share a personal story of why digging into Hannah's story was such a revelation to me. My little story goes back a full generation. The child that I'm going to talk about here is a new father himself now. Now, I was really lucky, and I had no problem conceiving and bearing children. During my first pregnancy with my older son, who, with his wife, now has a baby daughter, my boss then, the president of the Boston area health insurance startup where I was a corporate planner, backed me into announcing my pregnancy during a Friday afternoon staff party a few weeks earlier than I'd planned, and I was caught a little off guard. Now, during the party, one of our small staff, a woman in her early 30s, who was part of a huge Boston Irish clan like almost everyone else there, came over to me, flushed, I mean really red with fury, and demanded to know how long I'd been trying to have a baby. Now, she and I had always been casually friendly at work, but we'd never discussed each other's lives outside the office. And I was stumped by her resentment and sort of mumbled that I had no trouble. And do you know, she asked bitterly, I've been trying to get pregnant for 10 years. Why should you be able to have a baby so easily? Now, I was 26, one of the first of my friends to marry and think about children at all. I had no experience around fertility issues, about the pain of childlessness in a culture that greatly valued large families. And this woman's attack was obviously inappropriate, but her pain was real. And I gained an entirely new appreciation for my easy pregnancy that afternoon. So, flashback to something like 32 centuries earlier, a very different world from 1980s Boston. And we see that Hannah's story, which forms the first chapter and a half of 1 Samuel, that this begins with similar pain. We know the story, of course, Hannah's desperate prayer for a child, her promise to dedicate him to a life of divine service, and how she finds fulfillment in Samuel's birth. After delivering her toddler son to the high priest Eli to raise in the temple at Shiloh, she continues to visit him and bring him clothing and goes on to bear additional children, whom she and her husband Elkanah will raise themselves. So Hannah's story, the first chapter and a half of 1 Samuel, is famous for her passionate, silent prayer for a child, for a triumphant ode of gratitude to God for his birth, and for her strength in turning the child whose birth fulfilled her prayer over to temple service. And this is a very personal story. One of the amazing things about it is how Hannah's personal tale models profound national values and behavior for Israel, just as it's coalescing into a nation, probably only a handful of generations after the tribe's arrival in Eretz Yisrael. The midrash on this story, the rabbinic commentaries, which were rabbinic storytelling commentaries, which date from Hellenistic and Byzantine times, that is roughly from about the 3rd century through about the 8th century CE. The midrash promotes these moral and religious qualities as models for the community of Israel forever after. Jewish tradition has thus granted Hannah's story a prominent niche in Jewish liturgy as the haftarah for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, paralleling the Torah reading recounting the birth of Isaac. So before we move into the story itself, let's look very briefly, there's a lot more in the book, at the roots of the story. Modern scholarship considers this tale, which is the beginning, again, the beginning of 1 Samuel, to be part of the early history of Israel that encompasses Devarim, Yehoshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, Melachim, all of which focus on the primacy of worship in Jerusalem and of the Judean monarchy. It's probably derived from several ancient oral traditions and was probably first committed to writing as part of King Josiah's reforms of Judean religious practice, and was then expanded as part of the reorganization of Judean life following the return from Babel. The period of the composition for the books of Samuel as we have them now would thus stretch from about the mid-7th to about the mid-6th century BCE. Our story may incorporate even earlier sources, going right back to Shmuel, of course, that were reworked during Josiah's reign to produce a seamless account of the birth of the Judean monarchy. The major themes here are the importance of Hannah's childlessness, the national import of personal emotion, the power of personal prayer, and finally, the importance of devoted parenting. Yes, here in Tanakh. I've never seen rabbinic discussions of this theme, but it's there in black and white, and I'll show you. Let's explore each of these themes as they come up in the story and the paintings. So now, let's begin with the tale. If we could have, actually, this is the right slide. Okay. So the story starts. There was a man from Ramatayim of the Tzufim in the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah ben Yerucham, ben Elihu, ben Tohu, ben Tzuf, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives, one named Hannah and the other Penina. Penina had children, but Hannah was childless. Okay, so the author's very first words establish the family's nobility. He traces Elkanah's lineage back to Ephraim, one of the 2 half-tribes descended from Joseph, who obviously had been the Egyptian vizier and protector of his brothers. So in this first stroke, the author foreshadows the leader to come. We might also note that Elkanah's Ephraimite lineage tacitly brings to mind an earlier favored wife who bore children only after travail, Joseph's mother, Jacob's long-barren wife, Rachel. And we learned that this Elkanah's favored wife, Hannah, who is declared the embodiment of grace by her very name, Chen, is childless. So why was Hannah's childlessness so noteworthy that it begins the story of the man who established the Israelite monarchy? Why does this great leader have to be born of a long childless woman? We know that Shmuel is not the first Israelite leader born to a woman who had difficulty bearing children. Sarah, of course, bore Isaac at the laughable age of 90, only after angelic prophecy. Rachel was, of course, long barren before giving birth to Elkanah's ancestor Joseph, and sadly died in childbirth, giving birth to her younger son Benjamin. And Moses' mother, Yocheved, was one of the Israelite women in Egypt who had to coax her husband into marital relations at all so that she might conceive a child, contrary to that enslaved and reluctant husband's intent. In each of these cases, Israel's providential God needed to tweak normal human affairs to create the necessary and exceptional leader. So we can ask, what was the position of a childless woman in early Israelite society? The Iron Age tribal communities consisted of households that combined complex mixes of family relationships and also a whole spectrum of economic activities, farming, livestock management, household crafts, and so on, and obviously child rearing, all of which were bent on achieving self-sufficiency for the extended family. Scholars suggest that women were integrated into every aspect of household life, but there was also that question about the proper inheritance of the land, which, as we know from all over Tanakh, was a crucial, absolutely crucial principle in Israelite society. And so wives' very first responsibilities were to produce the children to inherit the precious family portion. And in Israel, as in the ancient Mesopotamia of Hammurabi's code, if a wife did not produce an heir, a man might take concubines or additional wives perfectly legally. Abraham had his concubine, Yaakov had at least a couple, even with a fertile wife. And so Elkanah married Peninnah, took an additional wife. Not only might the childless wife here suffer humiliation, which was, of course, Hannah's situation, but she could well be at material risk upon the death of her husband. We've, of course, seen how Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah were impoverished upon the deaths of their husbands. The early rabbis of the Midrashic literature were genuinely sensitive to the plight of the childless woman in Israel's patriarchal society. Exploring Sarah's gift of Hagar to Abraham in the Midrash on Breshit, the rabbis note that children often appear only after pain and toil. They ask, why were the matriarchs barren? And the answer they suggest, which I will tell you isn't very satisfying to me, is that the Holy One, blessed be He, yearns for their prayers and supplications. And they introduce a passage from Shir HaShirim, from Song of Songs, that's otherwise regarded in Midrash as God's plea for Israel's trust to explain the divine purpose underlying the matriarch's struggle to give birth. And this passage reads, because the Holy One, blessed be He, yearns for their prayers and supplications. Thus it's written, O my dove in the cleft of the rock. This is from the second chapter of Shir HaShirim. Why did I make thee barren? In order that, let me see thy countenance, let me hear thy voice. The rabbis simply urge women to trust in God. But we'll see how Hannah used her voice. Now, these first illuminations that you see here elaborate on these twin themes of the nobility of the family and Hannah's grief. The two paintings offer echoing images of olive trees. An olive motif necklace arches over the Hebrew text, and in the full-page painting, each woman stands under an olive tree, which in Psalm 126 symbolizes a happy, growing family, and across Jewish lore, nobility and anointment. But these women's olive trees are not the same. In the teardrop-shaped painting, Peninnah hovers over her children under a full fruiting olive tree. The late first-century commentator Pseudophilo suggests that Peninnah's daily derisive greeting to Hannah would be, do you mean to rise and wash your children and send them to school? That author has Peninnah compare herself to a flourishing olive tree, ridiculing Hannah this way, but you are a dry tree, Peninnah accuses. I know, moreover, that he, Elkanah, will love me, because he delights to see my sons standing around him like the planting of an olive grove. So, reflecting her emotions, Hannah has a barren, dry tree here, and she feels locked into a bubble of her own despair. Despite her husband's love, she is too humiliated to participate in the noisy family life, perhaps locked out by Peninnah's mockery. Lost in depression, she can't participate in the flourishing scenes surrounding her, despite Elkanah's embrace. Now, the two glass vessels on the text page express the same twin themes of Elkanah's nobility and Hannah's sadness. One midrash, this is Midrash Samuel, begins with a discussion of how the Israelites of the day had broken the Torah and that it was now time to stand up for God. And Elkanah would do exactly that. Another late midrash elaborates on Elkanah's and his family's pilgrimage habits, suggesting that by taking his whole family with him on pilgrimage to the shrine at Shiloh, every member of that family could teach other men, women, and children about sacrificing to Israel's God. And this idea reminded me of a midrash about Abraham's influence on people he encountered while traveling from Haran in Mesopotamia to Israel. A vial of myrrh closed with a tight-fitting lid and lying in a corner so that its fragrance was not disseminated. As soon as it was taken up, though, its fragrance was disseminated, was spread. Similarly, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Abraham, "Travel from place to place, and thy name will be great in the world." Hence, get the, Lech Lecha. So here on this painting, you see an image of a Canaanite-era perfume flask spilling droplets of perfume to convey Elkanah's Abraham-like ability to spread worship of God through his travels. The shards of broken glass under the text hint at the sharpness of Hannah's pain. Now, you can see there's a calligraphic border surrounding the teardrop painting, and that offers lines from a woman's devotional poem, a Techina. We've talked about these lots in the past, by a late 19th century Moravian rabbi's daughter, Fanny Neude. Originally written in German, this poem for a childless wife presents Hannah's prayer as the model for that of a Jewish woman of her own day. So, against the backdrop of a healthy, prosperous, probably noisy household, and under the mockery of her husband's second wife, Hannah has shrunk in her own bile green bubble of depression. Now, keep an eye out for the role of personal emotions throughout the story. Next slide, please. Next, can we move on? Sure, can you get us the next slide?
I'm sorry, I am working on that, just a moment.
Oh, that's fine, okay.
Yeah. Here.
Great. Well, so let me go on and start talking here. You'll see the image and hopefully in a moment. Ah, there we go. Beautiful. Okay. So the family has camped at Shiloh, and they're preparing for the next morning's offerings. In the distance, we see tents. No, back one. In the distance, we see tents of other families who, according to Midrash, have followed Elkanah, his wives, and children. At right, you can see Penina dressing her children in new clothing for the event, and she casts sort of a derisive look toward Hannah. At left, though, Elkanah kneels to offer food to Hannah as she looks away in depression. Before we move ahead, let's take full note of the centrality of the personal emotions here. The storyteller not only tells us about Hannah's deeds, but also those emotions, and secondarily, her husband's. We know that Elkanah's other wife is her rival, with the power to make her miserable about her lack of children. And far from neglecting his beautiful, graceful, but evidently infertile wife, Elkanah fully senses Hannah's pain. Now, I should break in here and say that there is debate about this. There are sources who believe that Elkanah was really making fun of Hannah. I don't think that's the case here. I feel that Elkanah fully senses Hannah's pain, and he's doing everything he can to comfort her, playfully nudging her. We can almost see him chucking her under the chin. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? I think he's trying to tell her that he loves her nonetheless. And on an otherwise bright afternoon, clouds hide the sun above the unhappy woman. Even so, cedars and palms, whose strength, height, and sweet fruit, the psalmist in Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat, compares to those who worship God in the temple, rise above the scene and prefigure all to come. The righteous bloom like a date palm. They thrive like a cedar in Lebanon. Planted in the house of the Lord, they flourish in the courts of our God. So next slide, please. One more. Oops. How are we doing?
We're good. I'm sorry. It's just every time I zoom in, it exits.
Oh, so forget the zooming. Let's just center it on the screen and we'll deal with it that way. It's not, the zooming's not worth it. Lovely. Okay, very good. So Elkanah offers grain, oil, and livestock. If you could pull it up a little bit, that would be great. He offers grain, oil, and livestock from his lands to God at Shiloh. Hannah, meanwhile, goes into the shrine and offers prayer with her lips, hands, and heart. The tale tells us. And she made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant, and if you will remember me, and not forget your maidservant, if you will grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head. She wants to turn him into a Nazarite in service of the temple. The micrographic text that you see curling through the paintings presents verses from Ashrei, Psalm 145. The Lord is near to all who call him with sincerity. He fulfills the wishes of those who fear him. He hears their cry and delivers them. At left, the Hebrew words rise from Hannah's hands as she offers her prayer. Traditionally, importantly, held to be the first Israelite silent prayer to Israel's providential God and her remarkable promise to dedicate that child to divine service in the temple. Now, micrography presenting a midrash of Rabbi Tanhuma commenting on that passage from Ashrei rises between the lines of Hannah's prayer. Now, take a look at the bracelets. The designs engraved on them express the woman's love for God. As we've seen before, the palm motif alludes to the righteousness and fruitfulness of those who worship in God's house, while the graceful gazelle, in a metaphor drawn from medieval Sephardic poetry, and actually from Shir Hashirim before that, suggests the beauty of the love between God and Israel. So what's happened here? The tale began with the story of Hannah's fervent, until now frustrated desire for a child. And how does Hannah finally achieve this dream? She quietly prays to God for a child, the earliest silent prayer recorded in all of Tanakh. We imagine her sitting in a corner of the sanctuary, maybe rocking back and forth slightly, hands reaching urgently toward the heavens, eyes squeezed shut in her intensity, and lips moving slightly but silently. So next slide, please. Sure, can you get the next slide? How are we doing?
Hi, I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's more complicated this time somehow than usual.
Yeah, I don't know why. I do have it on, it was showing on my screen, it just wasn't sharing on.
Oh, okay, fine.
For some reason, I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Is it coming up?
I don't see it yet. No, now we've gone blank. Or we just see the Jofa logo.
Oh no.
The joys of modern technology. There we go. Yep, okay. So Hannah's behavior, sitting there, maybe rocking back and forth, mumbling under her breath. Her behavior is so odd that the high priest assumes she's drunk. He has never obviously encountered silent prayer before. She's the first. And how long, he asks contemptuously, will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Sober up. That's literally what he says in the text. But mollified by her earnest explanation that she had been pouring out her heart to God, Eli softens and responds, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him. Eli's words give Hannah the confidence that she'll now be granted her wish, and she pulls herself up and accepts food, signaling her rising out of her earlier depression. Now, Jewish tradition credits Hannah with inventing two aspects of prayer that day in Shiloh. Most important, her prayer at the temple is considered both the first instance of and the correct paradigm for silent prayer. Now, there's not really time to pursue this idea here further, but I've included other sources and ideas in the book about the importance of Hannah's prayer in the commentaries. It's interesting to note that while Hannah's public cry of triumph, her song that we'll get to very shortly, attracts very little special attention, the prayer that flowed from her most private anguish becomes a model for the entire nation of Israel forever after. So Eli is certain that Hannah's drunk. Why else would a woman enter that sacred space and simply mumble? And we see him leaning near a cult stand, supporting an incense bowl and an altar, glaring at the spectacle that she presents. Only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. And so he says, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Sober up." And as we mentioned a moment ago, Hannah replies, "Oh no, my lord, I'm a very unhappy woman. I've drunk no wine or other strong drink, but I've been pouring out my heart to the Lord." And on the adjacent page, we see Hannah seated as I imagine, eyes squeezed shut with the fervor of her plea to God. And the potted palm alludes to the fruitfulness of the life promised by the psalmist to the righteous planted in the house of the Lord. Now, the border of these paintings offers a motif of stylized lotus blossoms, adapted from a pendant dating from 14th century BCE Givon, just shortly before, maybe a century or two before this story. In contemporary Egyptian mythology, and Egypt was the overwhelming cultural influence in Israel at this time, lotuses were a symbol of rebirth. Here, they allude to the rebirth that Hannah and her nation will enjoy as the consequence of her prayer. Okay, next slide, please. Lovely. Okay. Finding fulfillment at last, Hannah arises to present her child to the world, naming that child God Heard. The glow of the morning sun illuminates mother and child, as well as the plants and animals that speak to the promise that her newborn son bears for their land and the people. The scene reveals jars brimming with oil and wine, revealing the secure bounty of Elkanah's household. And that small potted palm just inside the balustrade reminds us again of Psalm 92's promise that the righteous would go straight and fruitful as a palm. Palms and cedars growing in the fields extend the same message across the family's lands. Now, that stalk of pink lilies glinting in the early sun that you see rising through the text at the left, this, in one of my favorite midrashim, reminds the viewer of the value of Israel and the Ten Commandments in the corrupt human world. The dove rising from the balustrade reminds us of Israel's trust in God, as the eagle, who symbolizes God's parental care, soars through the dawn sky, its wings touched with the morning light. Now, let me point out the English micrography in these paintings. The text is an amazing poem called "Like a Birthing Woman" by the late, much beloved Bible scholar Tikva Frimer-Kensky. The poem draws on a phrase in Psalm 48:7, "Chil kayoleda," strong as a birthing woman, comparing armies in battle to the force of childbirth. Now, the poem is really long, so I can't possibly read the whole thing here, but let me give you just a drop of it. It's fabulous. "The time has come. On the high mountain of my pain I climb, I who brings good tidings. I lift my voice with strength. I cry aloud, behold our God. Sound the trumpet, for I hear the rushing of a mighty force. I howl, the divine day is at hand. The coming of the Lord shakes the earth, shakes the people, shakes the soul. We howl, we quake, our faces flame. We feel the power of the divine host. My hands grow limp. My heart is trembling, pangs and throes. Chil kayoleda." Next slide, please. Let's see. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. So Hannah nurses her son Shmuel under a leafy, fruiting olive branch, reversing Penina's earlier mockery. And she's wearing a coat of many colors, like that of her family's ancestor, Joseph. On the adjacent painting, we see a contemporary ritual stand full of meal, just like that which Hannah's family might have offered along with their bull when they brought Shmuel to the temple at Shiloh. Again, you see here the water lotus to foreshadow the renaissance that Samuel's leadership will accomplish for the people of Israel. Next slide, please. And now for something completely different. And Hannah prayed, "My heart exults in the Lord. I have triumphed through the Lord. I gloat over my enemies. I rejoice in your deliverance. While the barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn. The Lord deals death and gives life, casts down at Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He casts down, he also lifts high. He raises the poor from the dust, lifts up the needy from the dunghill, setting them with nobles." Hannah sings in praise of her God-given triumph, yet her shirah, her epic poem, barely relates to her precise situation. Instead, her song is a classical psalm of exactly the same genre chanted in the temple. Indeed, the passage I just read you about raising the poor from the dust and giving children to barren women appears in very similar form in Psalm 113, which is, of course, the beginning of the Hallel cycle that's central in our festival liturgy. But this is a song of victory, a triumphant shout of victory after battle, of uplift from obscurity. And as any woman who has borne children, or any man who has accompanied her, knows, childbirth is battle. The moment when she rests with her new baby in her arms, triumph. The illuminations present a birth canal of sorts, its muscular walls lined with cervical cells, pulsating, twisting with birth contractions, imagery of crowning infants and symbolic plants and animals emerging from the tissues, weaponry and images of idolatry being sucked back into oblivion. An eagle, alluding as ever in this work to God's parenting of Israel, flies over the scene. The caper branches, grain, and roses emerging from the contractions symbolize Israel's perseverance, sustenance, beauty, and the inextinguishable good and evil found among Israel, while a bow and arrow, spears, and a Canaanite scepter are sucked below. A scale of justice, suggested by verses 6 to 8, lifts high the dove, representing Israel's compliance with divine law, while bringing down the horned sun disk crown of Egypt. The final contraction reveals the harp of David, the anointed one, who, after all, was appointed by Hannah's son Shmuel. Next slide, please. Great. And now we're approaching the end of Hannah's own recorded story, which is, of course, just the beginning of her beloved eldest son, Shmuel. I mentioned a surprising theme about parenting when we began. So here we go. Let me read this to you and notice what's happening in the text. Then Elkanah and Hannah went home to Ramah, and the boy entered the service of the Lord under the priest Eli. Now, Eli's sons were scoundrels. They paid no heed to the Lord. This is how the priests used to deal with people. When anyone brought a sacrifice, the priest's boy would come along with a 3-pronged fork while the meat was boiling, and he would thrust it into the sacrificial cauldron or the kettle or the great pot or the small cooking pot. And whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take away on it. This was the practice at Shiloh with all the Israelites who came there. But now, even before the suet was turned into smoke, the priest's boy would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Hand over some meat to roast for the priest, for he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw." And if the man said to him, let them first turn the suet into smoke, and then, in concordance with the ritual, and then take as much as you want, he would reply, "No, hand it over at once, or I'll take it by force." The sin of the young men against the Lord was very great, for the men treated the Lord's offerings impiously. So These are the sons of Eli the high priest. And in contrast, Samuel was engaged in the service of the Lord as an attendant, girded with a linen ephod. His mother would also make a little robe for him and bring it up to him every year when she made the pilgrimage with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord grant you offspring by this woman in place of the loan she made to the Lord," and then they would return home, and so on and so forth. So this juxtaposition of two very different sets of parents, two very different sets of children, fascinates me. This is such a dramatic contrast that in the book, I compare it to Shakespeare's contrast of Wild Prince Hal and the noble Harry Hotspur in Henry IV. Now, the author tells us just a few words about Hannah and Elkanah's parenting. He really only tells us that they saw their son each year upon the annual pilgrimage, and that Hannah would bring him a fresh robe each time. But inserting this characterization of Eli's ghastly sons here speaks volumes. The juxtaposition of the young priest's dreadful behavior, which will shortly cost them their lives, against the national heroism that would mark Shmuel's life, pits Eli's incompetence as a parent against Hannah and Elkanah's careful parenting, even when exercised from afar. How is this? Clothing and the passing along of clothing, particularly in a priestly context, has powerful symbolism in Tanakh. In Bamidbar, Aaron's priestly robes were stripped from him and placed on his son Eleazar. Remember, Aaron had disobeyed God's orders about the waters of Meribah and lost the privilege of entering Eretz Yisrael. And as he's about to die on Har Chor, his son Eleazar, who's going to inherit the position of high priest, literally assumes the mantle. Here, Eli is about to forfeit the entire priestly lineage because of his parental laxity, while the parents of the leader who succeed him are the ones to give that boy his new robe each year and are the ones whose values he will carry onto the national stage. In the paintings, we see a little robe such as Hannah might have brought the young Samuel. And so the child Samuel, born and raised with his parents' model of divinely inspired values, leading people on pilgrimage, descended from Joseph, the great leader, grows into the genuine leader who throughout his life will reflect honor onto his parents. It's their kind of righteousness, the good deeds and good name and divine favor passed on to their son Shmuel with his little robe, that garner the authority necessary to build the unified Israelite nation from the disparate tribes. Now, the ending of Hannah's story is also the real ending of the chaotic era of the judges. Israel now has the leader who will begin to establish order and convey the prophecies that God will fill. You can see that the illuminations are bordered by golden and jeweled necklaces, recalling the passage from Shir HaShirim, "Your cheeks are lovely with jewels, your neck with strands of beads. Let us make you golden jewels with silver droplets." Midrash on this passage compares the jewels mentioned here to the Torah, prophets, and Ketuvim, the silver droplets to the Song of Songs, which the rabbis considered the essential expression of the love between God and Israel. Together, these women's texts complete the body of the Tanakh, just as a woman's jewels provide the finishing touches to her toilette. And now, as Hannah's story ends, the jewels that adorn these pages bring to a close this tale of one of Israel's foundational women. Now, as I promised, I'd like to properly introduce Ingrid Cohn-Paymar, who not only is a longtime friend, but more importantly now is a therapist with a particular expertise in infertility and pregnancy loss issues. Ingrid is a licensed clinical social worker in Baltimore. She served as the medical social worker for the infertility clinic at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York City. She was a founder of the Pregnancy Loss Support Program at the National Council of Jewish Women in New York, which offers phone and group support for couples experiencing pregnancy loss and infertility. She is the co-author with Perry Lynn Moffitt of the book A Silent Sorrow, pregnancy loss, guidance and support for you and your family, which includes issues of infertility. She's presented at professional conferences nationally and internationally, and now has a clinic-based practice and a private practice in Baltimore. Ingrid will discuss these matters of infertility, childlessness for a few minutes, and then Cheryl will pass us your questions. And Ingrid, please do say when you want the next slide, which is your resource sheet, to come up. So Ingrid, all up to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for asking me to join you in this really beautiful presentation. Just really very delightful. And I'm just going to share a few thoughts and remarks on really primarily self-care while enduring the challenges of infertility. I think it's so interesting, as you mentioned, Debbie, that Hannah's prayer indeed is a silent prayer as she prays for a son, and that reflects how intensely private the whole issue of fertility and in particular infertility is. And yet, one of the things that makes it so difficult is that it is also painfully public, as you also talked about in the early pages of your beautiful manuscript, where you show Penina really mocking Hannah. And of course, it's very public if one has children or not. So I want to talk about some of the emotional issues and some of the practical issues that can come up. And then I want to really focus on some steps of self-care that can really be helpful and potentially quite transformative in dealing with an infertility challenge. So some of the effects of infertility are definitely woman and a man can both deal with lowered self-confidence and lowered self-esteem. Women who may be extremely successful in every other aspect of their life, marriage, work, career, thrust into a position of feeling really very helpless in achieving what a basic goal, or maybe a basic goal for her and in her community. And her husband also, very importantly, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, feels particularly helpless. Also, very difficult feelings can come up with infertility that may really feel very alien to the woman. And I think your personal story, Debbie, really reflects this. Your co-worker probably wasn't accustomed to having angry outbursts in public. And couples enduring infertility will talk about feeling intensely angry and jealous and resentment of friends and strangers alike. So those are, that is just a part of the emotional process dealing with infertility. Other challenges can be marital stress for all kinds of reasons we'll touch on more. Work stress. Imagine someone going through treatments where she needs to request leave from work periodically, maybe on a monthly basis, to go in for some treatment, and she doesn't necessarily want to tell the world at work why she has to leave early once again. Is enduring physical discomfort of medical procedures. There's actually physical pain. There's pressure and conflict from the family and from the in-laws. People saying, well, when are you going to have children and what are you doing about it? And asking questions, and perhaps even more distressing, giving well-meaning but really not helpful advice. Thing this couple needs to endure because they're probably researching tremendously and they don't need other people's advice in this matter. And then there's social discomfort. People actually can go through losing friendships over infertility, and people who have been friends not knowing what to say, handling it in a way that is well meant but maybe unkind, and maybe on the side of the infertile couple, also some withdrawal. So there can be really changes in something as fundamental as important friendships. And then, of course, the practical issue of financial stress. There are infertility treatments, for example, as well done with in vitro fertilization, that are extremely prohibitively expensive. And people really do take out mortgages and second mortgages on their homes in order to have children. So the stress is really it's legion, and it's in so many of these areas. Now, I also want to mention some very beautiful things come out of this challenge and this hardship. And women and couples also may talk about feeling intensely close to Hashem. And as Hannah clearly felt as she was pouring her heart out silently in the temple. Couples may grow close as a couple because they are pulling together. It's like you're a war comrade. You're together and struggling with something that is so difficult and other people around you may not understand. And couples really do, they may build a marriage that is intensely strong. And they know when they've gone through infertility that nothing can shake this marriage. They may also emerge with a community of new friends. If they reach out to a community of other couples who are striving to become pregnant, that can become a community of very precious friends and friendships. Very importantly, when a child does come, have endured infertility, child, every moment of every day, that child is a miracle, as every child is, but these parents' eyes are open to that miracle, and that endures, and that really can be a tremendous gift. And just generally, when a couple endures such a hardship, it really does make one more aware of the things we take for granted all the time when they go right. Just in general, every single person's health in the family, every achievement, people become much more aware and deeply, deeply grateful of the blessings that fill our moments and that many of us take for granted. So that's a little bit of an overview of some of the emotional aspects, some of the challenges, and some of the blessings that may come. I want to just talk very briefly, specifically about some self-care steps that women and couples may take. And one thing that, again, that is really referred to in the Hannah story is that I think generally, unlike Penina, people really mean well and don't try to say anything hurtful. However, anyone who's been through infertility, I think every couple that I've talked to who has been through this journey will have many stories of hurtful things that were said to them. And so one of the things that is so important, considering the privacy, the intimacy of the issue and the public nature of the issue, and also that people who haven't gone through it are not going to understand. They don't understand all the myriad challenges. They don't understand the day-to-day roller coaster. They just really won't have any idea what you're going through. I really want to just stress the importance. You don't need to go through this alone. Find the right people who can really hold you figuratively and support you through this journey. This may be family or friends who understand. It may be a rabbi or rebbitzin. It's not going to be everyone. Find the right one. It may be a qualified therapist, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the resource list, or an in-person or online infertility support community. And really having people you can check in with, even if it's 5 minutes a day, who just get it, just being able to say, went to the doctor today, it was the day for my shot, and then people go, oh yeah, know what you're going through, all the best. That can be a transforming moment in your day. I'm going to mention also, of course, the importance of spiritual self-care, prayer, saying psalms, and donating time, cause, and the merit of a positive resolution. One of the most difficult things is the feeling of being out of control. You can do certain things and take the medical steps and follow all the advice, but we don't control when we conceive. So taking on a beautiful charitable effort, it could be something that takes It could be a phone call. Doesn't have to be time consuming, but something that you have control over, that you know is bringing something beautiful into the world, is tremendously beneficial and positive. A constant theme with infertility and with pregnancy loss: recognize that your husband or your wife is under similar stress, but likely expressing this differently and coping very differently. And I'll just leave that if people have some particular questions, we can get to those later. But this can't be overstated. Husbands and wife, men and women, show feelings differently, have different coping styles, and just understand they're also going through something extremely difficult. Please be prepared for well-meaning but hurtful comments. There are innumerable examples, but what I just want to say is be prepared. Think about, is this relationship very important to me? If it is, you may want to kind of have something planned ahead of time. If someone asks an intrusive question or makes an intrusive comment, you do want to take care of yourself by setting a polite limit. It could just be something as simple as, I just really prefer not to discuss this right now, if you don't mind. I really appreciate your concern. And then just be prepared to kind of talk to yourself for a moment, remind yourself, well, she doesn't know what to say. Most certainly not done out of a wish to harm, but really ignorance of not knowing what to say. Just a couple of final points. One is that going through infertility, it can be very emotional and conflicting to get invited to simchot. So, if you are going through treatments and you've just found out that you have not conceived this month, and then you're invited to or a relative's simcha, a bris, or a baby naming, or a wedding, whatever it is, like it is the last thing in the world that you want to do and the last place that you want to go. Or, Debbie, as you and I talked about before, it could also be that you think you're going to be fine, and you get to a simcha and you realize that you're really just about to fall apart. So what I want to just mention about simchot, just plan in advance and talk with your partner that you may want to leave early. You'll give yourself permission to stay as you're comfortable, and if it starts to become uncomfortable or painful, have your exit plan. Just have your little signal that you tell your partner and step out early if you need to. Take care of yourself. You've put in your appearance. That's fine. And then just finally, working with infertility is a marathon. Hopefully, we hope that it will be as short as possible, but it's something that does tend to go on, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. So important to keep open communication with your partner, because you will both be going through stress over time. And as I mentioned before, the stress that you each experience is unique to each of you. Sharing your courage and your pain with love and understanding can build an unshakable bond. And may each member of Klal Yisrael be blessed with a healthy child or children at the right time. Thank you.
Great. Do you want to put up the resource sheet?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay. The last slide, please, Sharon. There we go. You want to talk that through a bit, Ingrid?
Yes. Okay. So here's some list of some online infertility support groups and support organizations. They offer a range of services, from a community to sometimes referral services. Some of them even have financial help for infertility treatments. I just encourage you to look at each one of them, depending on what you may be looking for or needing. And again, just to mention, we're not endorsing any one of these organizations, but just to share with you, here is a partial list of some resources that do exist. Also, very important to realize, your average therapist may really not know how to be helpful with infertility. So the fact is that this is something that you're probably going to get much better help who has experience working in the field, as we've talked about how complex the issues are. And there are some good ways to get names of people who are qualified, of therapists who are qualified to help. Your rabbi or rebbitzin may know of some people who are really good in this area. Your medical specialist should have a referral list. Your local infertility support organization should have therapists. And if you're near a medical center with a recognized endocrinology or infertility department, they also should be able to give you a good referral list. So those are the resources, and thank you so much.
Lovely. So should we move to questions, Shira?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Let's actually start with a question that was submitted online just now. And since we were, Ingrid, you were just speaking, I'm going to direct the question towards you. The person asked about rates of infertility and pregnancy loss in the Jewish community, if it differs at all from other groups, if it's particularly high.
So I'm going to say that I don't really have the latest data on this, but to my knowledge, it is no different. To my knowledge, it is no different from the general community. What's interesting is that, for example, pregnancy loss, it could be even what we call preclinical, where the women may have a slightly late period, is really very high, maybe 25 or 30% of all pregnancies. But to my knowledge, the infertility rates are not different in the Jewish and general communities.
Got it. And are there statistics for how common issues of infertility are?
There are. I don't have that at my fingertips, but the statistics do exist, yes.
Got it.
Do you know where anyone would look to find them?
Just Google the question.
In this day and age, yes, right?
Yes. I know that there are a couple of posts on Joyful's blog at the Jewish Week. We've written about infertility issues a couple of times. We have one that was published quite recently. It's I think the name of the piece is "My Struggle with Infertility," and I believe that piece quotes a statistic. But in general, the Joyful blog has a lot of resources on personal stories that people have of struggling with infertility. So it's another place to look for if you're looking for some support.
That's great.
Great.
Another question. This one was submitted earlier online, and this is for you, Deborah. And I know you touched on this a bit during your talk, but the question is about why we read Hannah's story specifically on the high holidays. You know, that are
sure. That's an easy one. Yeah. It's we read it after or accompanying the story of the conception of Isaac, which is first day of Rosh Hashanah, because these are the stories of two important leaders who both had to be conceived with a little tweak from God. And
do you think that there's, and I think this is open to either of you, but do you think that I know that I find it so interesting that we talk about issues of fertility, not only in the Torah, but also in the Torah portion. Do we think that there's something unique about that kind of struggle or about that type of prayer that we can sort of tap into on the high holidays?
Well, there's a question of faith, certainly in the Chanukah. I mean, Sarah was skeptical. She laughed, right, at the notion of becoming pregnant. Hannah seeks it out from God. I'm sorry, run the question by again. I lost my train of thought.
I guess I was asking if if there's something unique about the struggle of fertility, that
Got it.
that kind of struggle is somehow linked to
Well, it took prayer. She had to pray. She had to ask God for this. And on the Yomim Noraim, of course, we are immersed in prayer. These are the stories of great leaders who had to pray for children, and the prayer produced great leaders. So there's this sort of feedback loop there, so it's about the intensity of prayer. It's about needing God. It's about trusting in God. But I think something else to consider is that if you look back into the archaeological record, infertility was probably not an uncommon circumstance at all. If you read Rediscovering Eve, I can get you the author in just a moment. Her name's on the tip of my tongue. I know her. She's an archaeologist at Duke. There's discussion about the health of people in the early biblical era when they're doing basically subsistence farming on it's land of milk and honey, but it's also rotten farmland, and by and large, and people were not healthy. It's hard to believe that infertility was not a common circumstance, and that may be part of what we're seeing reflected here too. But I think the reason these readings are chosen is that it's a matter of needing God for this most fundamental of human functions and learning to pray for these children.
Mm-hmm. And Shira, I love the question, and I love your thoughts, Debbie. I have two additional thoughts. One is that for the high holidays, in general, we talk about the best vessel we can for
yes,
and that, for example, with Sarah, why did Sarah Imenu need to daven for a child for 90 years? Imagine what a tremendous vessel she was at that point, which enabled her to become the first of our Imahot. So really, she built through prayer such a beautiful capacity to become a leader and the mother of the Jewish people. The other thing that comes to mind is that on high holidays, prayer, of course, is we're praying for life. And our children are our life. They're our legacy, and they're our life beyond this lifetime. So I think that all as well ties in.
That's lovely. That's lovely.
Thank you, both of you, for those responses. Another question that we had submitted, and again, Deborah, this touches on a lot of what you were talking about already, but there's a question about how does Elchanan fit into this story, with Hannah's struggle with infertility. And I noticed, Deborah, that that you made a choice to read him as the supportive husband, and that that you intentionally at certain points chose to read, even when the Midrash felt otherwise, that he was the loving and supportive husband. And I'm interested in that choice you made.
Well, that's simply the way I read the text pshat. It's a human story, and I literally can see him just sort of chucking her under the chin. Come on, chin up, girl. I love you. You mean more to me than 10 sons. I mean, these are his words. So I don't think he's making fun. I don't think he's mocking her. I don't think he's saying, oh, you're a hopeless case, but I love you anyway. I think he's trying to give her confidence that she is loved at the most fundamental husband and wife level. And the Midrash tends to be very sympathetic to him and rather to her. And I think it's reasonable to see that transfer to him. He is in every other way, in Midrash, the very model of a leader of his generation. The Midrash goes into great detail about how he would lead his wives and children in take a different pilgrimage route every year, different route to get to Shiloh every season, so that they would encounter different groups of people, and he and his family could teach their peers that they passed about sacrifice, and that ultimately he would take as many as 60 families with him. He's presented as a good guy. And so it just doesn't really fit into that schema for him to be mocking his wife. So that's the way I read. That's the way I read it. Now the rabbis tend to be in Midrash. They tend to be very black and white. There is very, very little gray in rabbinic opinions about people. For instance, in the Ruth story, because Ruth is good, Orpah must be absolutely rotten. And so while Ruth goes on to go to do all this wonderful stuff with Naomi, when the evening of the afternoon, when Orpah leaves Naomi, following Naomi's orders and doing the common sense thing, the Midrash has it that she's raped by 100 Philistines, and her great zechut is then to give birth to Goliath. You know, she has to be as bad as they can get because Ruth is as good as it can get. So it doesn't make sense to me that they would be critical of Elkanah's behavior toward Hannah, since in every other way he's a paradigm of virtue.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ingrid, I was wondering if you had any thoughts to share on the role of one's partner in struggling with fertility.
Well, I think actually Elkanah's almost plea to Hannah that he should trying to comfort her because he loves her so much, I think really reflects in a very strong way the husband's desire to make things right, to take care of his wife and to provide what she needs. And this is also where I mentioned before that infertility taps into a very painful sense of helplessness, both for the husband and wife. And I feel that in some respects, Hannah really depicts his efforts and ultimately his helplessness. He's not the one who can help her with this.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, we've definitely gone a little bit over the amount of time we usually take, so I'm gonna wrap it up here. But I want to thank both of you. This was such a rich conversation, both in terms of Tanakh and really reading the text and seeing your beautiful artwork, Deborah, and Ingrid, you bringing helping bring out this real human dimension to the story, which Deborah, you do through your artwork, and Ingrid, you were able to bring through your experiences and working with couples that struggle with fertility. I know I think this is an excellent model of how we use Tanakh and our tradition to talk about real issues that real people struggle with. And I know that at JOFA we've recently been putting a lot of focus on issues of fertility and infertility and trying to push our community to talk about it. And this is such a great example of how it's not outside our tradition to be focusing on and to be talking about these issues.
Right inside it.
Yeah, it's so, I mean, whenever we think about fertility, it's right there from the very beginning. We're always talking about it. So thank you to both of you for taking the time tonight. Thank you for all the work you've done to prepare. And thank you for the resources you've offered. We will make those available to everyone. I also wanted to share that Deborah has been generous enough to offer a discount on 2 of her books, Arise, Arise, and Kabbalat Shabbat. Both of those, you can use the discount code HONEYBEE2017. Honeybee is in all capital letters. And you can find those details and the link to both books in the description for, like in the YouTube link. Just click on the description. You can click on show more, and then you'll see all the details. And we'll also be distributing that information along with the YouTube link. And I wanted to remind all our viewers that we're having lots of webinars in the upcoming weeks on high holidays. I believe the first one is going to be on a week from Monday. So follow us on Facebook. Visit our website, jofa.org, register to get our emails, and you'll be in the loop on all the wonderful things we're doing, just like this webinar that we did tonight with Deborah and Ingrid. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Shana Tova M'tuha.
Yeah.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.